This is the nuts and bolts of unionizing in medicine. At this point, things are moving along. There's a lot of groups that are making news for unionizing, residents and physician groups, but there's a lot of the contract management group model where some people are 1099s, contract to the hospital, all presents a lot of interesting legal scenarios for the possibility of unionizing. And we at Take Medicine Back don't specifically endorse one form of taking medicine back, but this is one of those options. And at this point, I think we really need to realize that we are exploited labor in sweatshops at this point, and make a move one way or another. So let's jump right in. I'll have let's kind of go round table and introduce ourselves. But we have Dr. Wiener here, attending at well, I don't know how much I want to disclose. So previous attending at my residency. And why don't we start with you?
So yes, I work at a level 1 trauma center in Detroit. We are employed by St. John Emergency Services, which is really just a subsidiary of TeamHealth. We kind of started fighting with them probably 7 years ago at this point, and had made very little progress. And so we actually talked to Joe at this point. So I'll let you kind of go over like the actual how unionization works. And then I can kind of give, I guess, more of like our journey trying to navigate the system as a group that is contracted to the hospital, because that makes unionization a lot more complicated. We are W-2 employees. So like that part of it wasn't as much of an issue because we were employed physicians, we weren't contractors. And then I can kind of talk about kind of the process too. And then if anybody has any questions, the question box thing, I'd say just yell it out. It's probably easier if we're not answering your question, because I'm terrible with Zoom. So I don't know, Joe, if you want to.
Hey, yeah, so I'm Joe Crane. I'm the National Organizing Director with the Doctors Council. We are the largest and oldest attending union in the country. And I've actually talked with a lot of people on this call and on the previous panels and whatnot over the last couple of years about what it would mean for them to unionize. I have successfully unionized coming up on 1,000 physicians, APs and PAs and NPs. And in the near future, that number is going to reach about 1,700, and I'm excited about that. I have a very large group about to step out of the shadows. So, but I can answer literally any question about unionization, big, small, complicated, whatnot, and I'm looking forward to doing that.
I'm Dave Feinwachs. I was for 30 years General Counsel for the Minnesota Hospital Association. I, for the same period of time, taught health law and policy at the University of Minnesota. And I've also been a lobbyist for 40 years, predominantly on healthcare issues. And I believe that unionization is a concept that is vitally important to address the notion of take medicine back. It's one of the tools in the toolkit that is going to be increasingly necessary and utilized, because between 75 and 81% of physicians, depending on who you talk to and where you are currently employees. So the time is right and the motivation is right.
Great, thank you guys. Why don't we start with sort of the case study with Dr. Wiener and experience of what has really happened, what the challenges are, and then we'll go to Joe Crane for a broader look at how you can go about steps, what challenges there are, and what you can, I think, reasonably expect from a union or not expect, because I think that's something that Joe's great at, is not overplaying what a union can do. But there's so many myths about it. Are we negotiating for a couple of dollars by striking, and we can't strike in medicine? So what does it really get us, and what's the point? But let's start with Dr. Wiener in terms of actual experience and what drove you guys.
So yeah, there are a lot of myths out there. When we first kind of approached our leadership, the first thing we were told is it's illegal, don't do it. And so, I mean, after talking to like 96 labor attorneys, when we realized that that's not the case, we've just been lied to all this time, then it kind of opens up a lot more options. So I would say if anybody is having trouble and you're kind of in this like pre-contemplative stage of like, what do we do? We're in a situation, we're not happy. We're trying to figure out a way to go to administration without getting fired, because that's obviously your biggest hurdle. Is you have this group of people, we're all very skittish. We can't get anybody on the same page. We don't work the same shifts in emergency medicine. So getting like a meeting of everybody is almost impossible. Like, where do you go? So our first step was essentially to form an organization. It's super easy. You literally just like file for an EIN number and a name under like whatever state you're in for the organization. You throw some bylaws up there, and then that kind of initially protects you under a concerted activity. So any two people working together is protected under union, like our labor law, almost as a union without fully being a union. So that would be my opinion for step one. That way you guys can start talking to people and feel like you have some protection. It doesn't give you like a ton, but at least that way people feel like there's something kind of more official than like one person running around by themselves trying to get everybody like moving in the same direction. Because a lot of times what happens in these cases, and this is what we've heard over and over, is that like one or two people start trying to get people to complain to administration or the hospital or whoever you work for, and those two people get fired and then the whole thing dies, right? And so that's how we had to kind of start, was to like protect everybody under this like kind of blanket organization, which we've actually turned into our own union now. And the problem with that organization is it does kind of give you a little protection, but you can't negotiate like you are a union. So the TeamHealth didn't actually have to legally sit down with us and negotiate in good faith. It doesn't give you like the ability to strike. So really, like if they don't want to meet with you, you have no backup plan. There's nothing to like force them to the table. And that's essentially what happened. They ignored us for another like 2 years. COVID hit. We kind of started focusing on that. And then when we came back after COVID, things were worse than they were before, and we still had no like real game plan. So we kind of moved on to then trying to organize more formally, because I think at that point we realized that we really needed the protection that the union would provide. So it makes it very difficult for them to fire us or to bring in another group, because that was also the concern. So let's say we just make a union and then the hospital says, well, TeamHealth's contract's up in 2 months anyway, we're going to get rid of them and bring in a different group. Well, at that point, it's very difficult it's considered like subcontracting. So while they could still try to do that, if they don't keep at least 50% of the people that were already there, it's a hard argument for them to make that they didn't just dump that contract to get rid of the union. So at least you have like some, a better standing than just like if most people have been through 3 or 4 groups in their career at the same hospital. They just keep bringing in a new group and dumping the old one. And then you're kind of left with whatever contract they hand you, or you don't work there. So that's kind of been our process. We literally just filed about a month ago under our own organization. We turned our original organization into a C5 organization that can be considered a labor organization, so we could represent ourselves. Like just to start, I mean, we might have to be absorbed by a bigger union at some point, but we hired labor attorneys. Yeah, and so the filing process is super easy. I think a lot of people are very afraid of that part of it. It's very geared towards the physician. I mean, you have months, if not years, to prepare. They give the employer, like once you file the cards, which are very easy to make up, it just basically says like, I want these people to represent me, and some basic information from everybody in a signature. You need 30% of people to file those, although I wouldn't recommend doing it until you have like 70%, because you need to get everybody on the same page. And then the employer essentially has 2 weeks to like challenge you in terms of, the organizing unit and the appropriateness of you guys actually unionizing. Like they tried to say we were supervisors, and that didn't hold up. We didn't actually even make it to a hearing. We managed to settle it outside of court. And then after that, you're allowed to have your vote. Like it literally is like 10 days notice, or we agreed to a paper ballot or a mail-in ballots because of the shift and trying to get everybody on is difficult. And so we're in the process now of actually trying to vote. But we've made it past all the legal, you can't vote, your supervisors, all of that stuff. That actually moved pretty fast. So if anybody
Michelle, how is convincing colleagues?
That part is probably the most difficult, I think. You have to have, if you're going to do this, you have to have somebody that's very committed. You need at least 1 or 2 people, depending on the size of your group. We have 51 people in our group, and we're spread across multiple hospitals. We decided to only do it at one hospital at first, because it's just too hard to like branch out and do everybody else. We had talked to people. We did, meetings don't work. You can try to organize a meeting and you'll get 10 people max to show up at anything. And that's usually your core group that is solid anyway. And those aren't the people you're trying to reach. you really need, and it's kind of funny. There are like organizing videos on this, and we kind of did it without that, but we followed the same process. You kind of know you have different groups in your of your colleagues, and certain people know certain people, and you know the people that are going to be on board, the people that are going to be kind of iffy, and the people that are going to be definite no's. And the goal was just to really get to everybody after shifts, like talk for 10 minutes after you sign out, just to be like, hey, listen, this is what we're thinking about doing. Where do you stand on this? Like, what are you thinking? Because there are a lot of myths out there in terms of like unionizing, and a lot of people are very afraid of it. Like, I'm a Republican, so like the state of healthcare is really screwed when a Republican forms a union, right? So like, I think a lot of people were like, oh, I don't want to touch that. They're like, like they just have all these kind of like misconceptions about what the union can do. And a lot of people were hesitant because they're like, okay, we're going to put all this money in because we had to put money up front. And then what is it really going to get me? But I think at some point it's worth the fight just to stand up for ourselves. I mean, even our hospital staffing, since we filed, because the hospital is the one that provides the nurses and stuff, and we were supposed to have 23 nurses, we'd show up and there'd be 5. All of a sudden, magically in the last 2 weeks, we're fully staffed every day. I don't know how that happened, but like it got people's attention.
That's a really, can you actually elaborate on what kind of drove you there? Like, at least in your mind, like when did the locum, or when did a union become an option or discussion about it happen after the takeover?
So, like I said, we've been trying to like negotiate with them for years. At some point, we did have a lawyer through our organization send them a letter saying we're not happy. We'd like to meet about all these patient safety issues and staffing and physician wellness kind of issues. They did initially meet with us, which basically went nowhere. And then after that, I think they realized as they were meeting with us, that was kind of a recognition of a kind of organized labor. And they like their lawyers told them you have to stop. Otherwise, you're like unofficially recognizing them as a union, basically. So then there was zero communication. And I think once the communication was gone and they kept handing us bad contract after bad contract, which we managed to get everybody on board with not signing. Then we kind of had to go to the next step of like, okay, so they're never going to sit down with us again. And we're going to keep going through the same cycle over and over again. We need to do something where it like literally forces them to the table. And that would be the other thing I'd say, like having some sort of communication with everybody. And like we have a WhatsApp group and we have an email, and it's kind of one person sending out all information to everybody is super helpful, because especially when they do hand you a bad contract, I was like, hey, listen, most people didn't even read it. Like, honest to God, that we've been handed 7 bad contracts, and this one, like, they're like, this will be better. They still didn't read it. So having one person say, no, I'm going to talk to the lawyer, and the lawyer says we'd be morons to sign this, and like getting all the information out there and what the lawyer's saying and having everybody on the same page is very, very helpful, because so many times there isn't communication amongst doctors. We don't want to like kind of clump together and fight with administration. We just want to do whatever is easiest and hope for the best. It really helps.
And just the last thing, well, what was it like clinically, or was it being like, was it wage theft, or was it understaffing, or what kind of pushed you to the point where like
It was both. We had no staff. The hospital, we had 75 people in the waiting room. And we had no nurses to bring the patients back. We had one transporter in the whole hospital. And then the response of our employer to that was, well, your patient volume has gone down. You're not seeing as many patients because we literally can't see them unless we go into the waiting room, which we were doing. So we're going to cut physician staffing too. And so we're going to call you 30 minutes before your shift and tell you not to show up, and we're not paying you for that. And so you're leaving the one person there, like Atlas holding up the sky, essentially, trying to keep the entire hospital together with all the patients being boarded and the people literally arresting in the waiting room. And we're just going to leave the one doctor who is there just to sink or swim. And so I think people were like, this isn't going to work. We're taking it from all sides, plus the patients, plus we have psychotic people, assaulting somebody on a weekly basis. It got to be the point where it wasn't safe for anybody. And we're taking on all that liability, and the only ones actually caring for the patients and pushing them to their ultrasounds and doing all the charting. And I mean, I was pushing meds at some point because we had no nurses, and I'm like, how do I push this fast or slow? And they're yelling across the room at me, so like, I think it just had gotten to the point where it wasn't safe anymore. And people just were so frustrated that they were willing to try anything. I think this is kind of like, well, like, it can't be worse than it is now. I think this
And
is,
that gets to the point, and I don't know if you're referring to somebody specifically about when a Republican says, all right, it's time for a union, we've got to a special place in medicine.
oh yeah.
Let me, yeah, go ahead, David.
I just want to jump in. If you stop and think about all the things we've discussed so far today, take any of the issues and put it against the backdrop of, what if there was a union? I don't want to supervise more people than I'm capable of. I don't want to supervise people who are not competent to do what they're doing. I don't want to participate in a system where I'm forced to sign things that can result in fraudulent billing or lead to malpractice or other things because the system is flawed and I don't want to do it. If you're on your own and you do this, you're going to get the axe. If there is some collective bargaining, if you have an organization, the kinds of things that I see physicians unionizing for are different than the usual money, I want more paid family leave, that kind of stuff. It is actually the integrity of the profession and the argument against, I don't want to be compelled to participate in dangerous and fraudulent delivery schemes. And a union is a very powerful tool in assisting to prevent those kinds of things. Whereas if you do it on your own, it's a big problem.
That's a great lead in for Joe, and we'll come back to David, because I think Joe has a lot of practical experience on having organized unions and what they can do. And then David might be thinking even grander scale about, how do we do this given the legal setup that physicians are in now, and what can a union or some other form of organization really accomplish. And I have one question for Michelle, but I'm going to give it to Joe, which is, why wasn't Michelle fired when she started thinking about and talking about unionizing? And there's a little state specific thing there too, but let's just say somebody wants to start or thinking about a union, and introduce yourself, and then maybe give us some of that background, and go from there.
Okay, so I'm Joe Crane. I'm the National Organizing Director with the Doctors Council. And I do want to echo what David just said. I can't tell you, I was taking notes during the meetings today, non-competes, due process, the whistleblowers, the cost of an attorney, all of these things and more are addressed by unionization. Just cause protection is huge. You don't understand what it is until you need it. But it goes into that due process. Whistleblowers, literally in the state of Minnesota, I just had a group, and I'll get to the question of the termination real quick, but we had a group who came out. The organization was firing their patients who couldn't afford to pay their bills. And the New York Times came in, coincidentally we're from New York, and they came in and did a story. The Attorney General came in and said they're investigating. The organization turned around and withdrew the policy and has now stopped it. Nothing has happened to those physicians because they know we're there. We represent people within their system. So anyways, there's a lot that can be done. As to why Michelle wasn't fired, I mean, that's a loaded question, but and at the end of the right, most of the time people don't get fired in unionization drives. So that's the first thing. It's a scare tactic they like to do, or they'll get someone for doing something else, and they'll show them the door. So my assumption is, Michelle, you are a good physician who does your job, and you don't throw things at the nurses and whatnot. So there's that. And if you were to be for anything for being looked at cross, going to the New York Times and having a story, telling people, inviting people to a meeting and being pulled in by your administrators and questioned whether or not you're a union supporter. You don't get fired for those type of things because you have the federal right to do these things. And when you're working with someone like myself, you have access to all the resources that we bring. We currently work with, I want to say, 3 different law firms and so forth, all the different labor, as I mentioned, political allies like the Attorney General and whatnot. There's a lot that comes to bear once you unionize and you come into the union family. So, but again, I can't speak to the specifics as to why. My assumption is, again, good doctor, and they don't have anything on her, and maybe they're not that invested in stopping this organization effort. I don't know.
Hubris and incompetence. A lot
There's
of
always that.
Hospital way too much credit too, guys. Like, have a lot of good lawyers on your side and look good on the news crying about children dying in the ER. They're not going to try to fire you.
Yep. If they did, there'd be bigger problems. So Mitch, what would you like me to talk about on this? You just want me to go through like the nuts and bolts of the basics, or what?
Yeah, I mean, there's already a couple specific questions, but and I'll elaborate like just a little bit with Dr. Wiener. Is one of the issues is we don't have due process, right? So if you're causing any problem, they don't have to say why you're fired. They just say we no longer need your services if you don't have due process, and you might be a 1099. What Dr. Wiener had mentioned before is that in the state of Michigan, forming that professional association may give you some protections, and that may be another discussion. Is, you know, is it state-based as well? But putting that one aside, if a physician, and I think there's probably a Dr. Wiener at sort of many different hospitals, but one of them, and then there's a whole bunch of people who are, you know, somewhere along that spectrum of a definite no or not. Let's say there's one person, how would they start? Should they contact you? Should they contact an attorney by themselves? Should they have some beers with their colleagues after work and just identify the right people? How should they start? And then what are the nuts and bolts of like the next steps?
Okay, so my perfect scenario is they contact me first before they reach out to some of their friends and get the beers, because sometimes those friends are supervisors, and that unbeknownst to them, legally speaking, and or they can't keep a secret, and it leads to other problems down the road. So if they reach out to me, then we sit down, we have conversations, we talk about what's going on, what the issues are, what they would like to see changed, and try and figure out who would be eligible to vote. And as Michelle pointed out, the organization sounds like weekly tried to argue that you were supervisors, which is a very classic tactic against physicians. And then the other one being the appropriate bargaining unit, I believe, like who all can vote. But it also sounds like they threw in the towel on those issues pretty soon. So I'm extremely glad to hear that. But we have to figure out who can vote. Make sure you're not a supervisor. We have to make sure you're, you know, not a 1099 employee, legally speaking, and other issues. But we go from that conversation. Normally, it's an hour or so conversation. It leads into another conversation with 2 or 3 of your friends. Ideally, people who we've vetted, we've made sure that they can come in, and the process starts building from there. You just continue talking. You keep expanding out. If it's a bigger group, I mean, if it's a group like Michelle's, I'll bring in one organizer. If it's a group of a couple hundred or 1,000 plus, I'll bring in multiple organizers, and we'll split it out because it becomes extremely labor intensive as this process goes along. And I'm going to go ahead and guess Michelle was the person sending out the messages and doing all the heavy lifting. So
Calling every single person before everything went out, before I submitted the cards, before, like, I call every single person, and it's a lot. You need like, or we have like 3 people that are now helping that'll kind of help branch out and call people, because you really do have to make sure everybody's on the same page. You don't want somebody coming back and being like, oh, you didn't tell me that, you know, like, because that kind of kills the whole thing and it kills your credibility. You need to be very honest and upfront with people about what you know, what you don't know, what you can do, because that way that you have to develop that trust. And I think a lot of people that have been working in departments for 20 years together already have that to some degree, you know what I mean? Like, so I think you have a good starting point, but like you said, you have to identify the 2 or 3 people you know aren't going to like throw you under the bus, because that time between when you say the word union and you file those cards is the most dangerous. Like, because that's when they can try to get rid of you. Once you file that card, they can't do anything to you, you know, like, because then their argument of, oh, I didn't fire you because you tried to unionize goes out the window. And there's a lot of strategy in doing that stuff, but it's the initial conversations where I think people are the most afraid. And I do want to say too, because I know people, you know, like will say, well, we supervise the PAs. Well, you know, we have PAs at our site. We're a very large site. We also have a residency program. So they did try to throw that at us at one point, saying, well, you guys are supervisors of the residents. But the residents don't technically work for us. They work for the hospital. So we are not their official supervisors. We can't hire or fire them. We can't, you know, so there's a lot of things that they'll try to throw at you and you think, oh, maybe that's legit, but it really doesn't hold up in court when you go to fight it. And the PAs too, like I don't make the PA schedules. I don't hire them. I don't fire them. I don't tell them where they can work. So that all ends up coming up. And so, but we kind of work through that. And I think a lot of sites are the same way.
And that's a very important point, because the supervision argument, which is the classic one they always use, is a double-edged sword. Because when they look into it, when the courts look into it, If they're saying you're a supervisor, then you have to have those rights. You have to be able to fire those PAs. You have to be able to schedule them. You have to be able to discipline. You know, the things attributable to the word supervision typically don't apply to the people accused of being supervisors.
Yeah. So just something that I really want to point out though, Michelle's case has been the best case scenario, which again makes me extremely happy that you all are actually voting, and I hope you win in the very near future. I can tell you there have been other cases out in, well, where is it? Bend, Oregon. They tried to organize all the physicians, NPs, and PAs system wide. They spent months in court, and the union ended up walking away. That was not me. I don't walk away from fights, but the union ended up walking away from that fight. And there was another group, union I used to work with on the West Coast. They filed with some residents, and at Loma Linda, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. It's a religious organization, and they are appealing into the courts. So over different legal issues. So like it's good that you got to where you're at, but the potential is some of these cases, they just have to appeal it. They don't have to reach a stipulated agreement, and they can appeal it all the way to the Supreme Court. And it can get extremely costly. And after the fact, there are legal challenges to be faced and other things. So there's definitely, it's a bumpy road, but once you get to the point where you've won and you're actually negotiating over your working conditions, it can be an immensely powerful tool that, I mean, I do this job so I can help you all change medicine. Any positive change that we can do to empower you all, well, next time I go to the doctor, maybe it's a slightly better outcome for me. So I'm 100% selfish on that. Now, just really quick, I see that there's some questions about physicians just being scared. Hi, Maltese dog.
The striking part, and I think that's important too. Like, we went into this saying to people, if we aren't willing to strike, we cannot unionize, because at that point, like, there's no point. Like, if everybody is saying like, no, I'm not willing to do this, and so you are allowed to strike. There was a group here of I think CRNAs that had unionized over at Beaumont Hospital in Michigan, and they just had the vote to strike, and their contract was settled within like 4 days. So I don't really know how much, I don't think many groups, especially in emergency medicine, would get to be actually striking. You can vote to strike. I don't think the hospital and the publicity and all of that, if you're shutting down an entire ER, I think they wouldn't let it get to that point. But like, you'd have to be prepared for that. You'd have to, like, physicians have to understand that, like, yeah, you don't get paid for those shifts, and if you don't show up, that's a realistic possibility.
Yeah, well, you all can definitely strike. That is a true fact by the National Labor Relations Act. If you're a state like public employee, that may be different. There was an independent group of physicians who have been unionized for a couple of years. They announced their intent to strike, and the state came in and said they did not have the right and stopped their efforts. That was California. So that goes back to getting organized and making sure you have legal advice and everything, not just thinking you can do something. But there have only been 4 strikes in American history, and 3 of them have been public sector, and 1 was in the private sector during COVID. I took them out on that. So you can do it. It is realistic. I hope it never happens again. But as Michelle just said, if you're not willing to fight, be ready to lose. Is the outcome that's probably going to play out.
Thank you guys for the information. This is Tim Titstrom from Richmond, Virginia. Interesting case study out of Japan. I think the bus drivers struck. They had a strike, but they still drove every day, but they wouldn't take a fare from anybody. How realistic do you think it is to like have a strike, but no physicians sign their charts, so they can't be billed?
That's
we
go
were
ahead,
told
Michelle.
we can't do that legally. So our labor attorneys said that you like, technically then they can actually fire you, because now you're not performing the service that you're there to do. You can, like, the federal law protects you for actual striking, but if you just refuse to do your job, like, that's not the same thing. I mean, I know there's some pilot strikes.
You would still see the patient, provide the care, but you wouldn't sign the chart to recoup the bill.
They were told us we were told that we weren't actually protected under federal law to do that, so they actually could go after us for that. Striking.
So Michelle, I don't want to discount your attorney, but I've definitely heard different from other counsel. And the no billing thing has been for part of a lot of the plans. It's going to be made out illegal, but at the end of the day, what you're saying is you're not like you're not following the rules, but you're standing there to help your patients on strike. I mean, and essentially, you're not doing billing, so you're not abandoning your patients, but you are there willing. Now, if they want to lock you out, that's completely up to them.
Like
So
you could, I'm sorry to interrupt.
no, it's okay. Go ahead.
You could write your complete note, but then just not sign it. I mean, so they couldn't bill for it.
I think you'd have to declare a strike first, is the thing, and then
I would go that would be my first route.
you actually have to vote to strike, and then try to work out who's actually going to be working, because technically you are going to have supervisors in your group too that would be working through the strike. So that's very complicated.
I just think it would be very unpalatable to most emergency physicians to abandon their patients, but to show up, do the work, and then just not let TeamHealth or Envision or the hospital recoup the bill. I think that would be pretty palatable to most people.
There's what everyone always goes to the strike. You do not start with the nuclear option. You know, I cannot stress that enough. Like, and once you get to a strike, you're talking about an overwhelming supermajority. Like, I only do 80+% of people saying, yes, this is something I'm willing to do, or we don't even do that. But like, if you think that is the only way that you can settle a contract, I can guarantee you that is the most powerful thing you can do, but it is far from the only thing you can do. David, it looks like you want to jump in.
I agree with that, because I'm not going to use the term correctly. It's almost like informational picketing. There is nothing that stops physicians from stating publicly, I showed up here today and I did my job as I was supposed to do, but I have no expectation of payment because I have serious concerns, and I want the government and the insurance companies and everybody to know that any bills you might have received for what occurred here today, at least by me, you know, I have no expectation of payment. I did this because I don't want to abandon my patients. It's a PR move, but it gets the point across, and I don't think it violates any laws.
Yeah. So, I mean, I mentioned this New York Times story. 6 physicians out of 600, just to be clear, 6 physicians out of 600 talked to the New York Times. It turned into a nationwide story. It was on CNN, Fox News, everywhere. It was spread throughout. 5 days later, there is very real change.
Joe, are you talking about the patients that were cut off from being seen because they owed money?
Yes, from Alina, yes.
I was actually behind the scenes. Let me tell you what happened there. Not going to say who. Somebody briefed some journalists here, and the journalists, after getting no place with the administration of the facility, contacted the Alina board members and said, are you aware that this is the policy? Do you agree with it, oh pillar of the community? And rather than answer the question, the policy was withdrawn the next day.
Like I said, the power of white coats to amplify a message. So if you have 50, the entire emergency department in Michelle's case saying no more, that's a nationwide story. All of a sudden, TeamHealth is looking at it. Their investors are looking at them like, what are you doing? What's going on? The community's freaking out. Like, you're not going to have to do it, but I get the fear. And without going into, because we only have 15 more minutes, but like, if anyone wants to talk pro idea of unionization, anything about the ethics of it, I can most definitely go over that. I will say though, that because anyone might be watching this in the future, I have seen so many physicians say, well, I would never abandon my patients. I'm just going to quit and go get another job. And I would challenge people to think that that's kind of kicking the can down the road. You're leaving patients in suboptimal conditions and potentially putting them at risk. So don't think that maintains your oath, as opposed to fighting for your patients and putting a tent outside that hospital and getting patients care as they come in. So,
or stated another way, what puts your patients more at risk? Collective action or allowing the corporate entity to do whatever they want? That's really the question you have to answer for yourself. Which puts patients more at risk?
Also, I had a question up there about ignorance, being told that you can't unionize. You most definitely can unionize, but I could tell you historically, you could not. Prior to the 80s, you could not unionize. And then, as everyone knows, I think someone in the chat mentioned it's like 20% of physicians are privately employed now, or own their own practice, and 80% are, or whatever that number is, I didn't know is quite to 80, but are employed. So, oh, I'm getting, that was me. So that number is why you can unionize. You are now an employee. Michelle is an employee. Someone tells her when she's going to be at work, when she's going to leave work. And they're getting to the point where they're starting to encroach upon your ability and your duty to actually make medical decisions, which is leading to people reaching out to people like myself and saying, I need help doing the job that I am the expert at, which is a terrifying perspective to be in. But this is where it's getting in this country. Other questions people have, or Dave, Michelle, anyone want to? I'm talking. Anyone can jump in here.
As long as, before we leave the Alina topic, I believe Mercy Hospital, which is an Alina facility, their hospital has just voted to unionize.
Yeah, if you look up here on the Minnesota part, yeah, that's Minnesota. That's that was me and my team that organized them.
I think it's going to get easier and easier there's a group in Oregon, an ER group that just unionized, that voted it through, that they were hospital employed. I think, and I said to our lawyers, like, doesn't this provide some sort of like case law? You know what I mean? Like, they already did it. How can they say I can't do it when all these other groups are doing it? And apparently, unfortunately, it doesn't work like that. Like,
it doesn't.
I thought they could set a precedent and we could be done, but apparently
No.
that's, you still have to fight it out on an individual case-to-case basis. But I think it makes it a way harder argument when all of these groups start falling and start doing this. They're going to have like less ground to stand on when they're like, no, there's 60 groups in the state that are already unionized. Like, and I do think it allows you to like speak as kind of one group. I think a lot of physicians, that's their biggest fear, honestly. Like, most people live paycheck to paycheck and they're like, what happens if I get fired? And so this kind of helps allow us to bring a lot of issues to the table without that fear. And so I think that was like the biggest selling point when you're trying to talk to your colleagues. Like, we're sick of being afraid and not being able to say anything, and this would actually help protect us. And at the very least, like, we can complain more and not get fired.
And again, it's what Dr. Lee said at the outset when he used the term sweatshop employee. If you're starting to feel like a sweatshop employee, it's time to consider remedies that are available to sweatshop employees.
It's true. They have, the nursing ratios, they can only see 5 patients. They put me in a room with 40 something people and say, go, like, okay, it's safe for me, but not them. I don't see how this works. Like, they obviously negotiated a better deal than we did.
Just on that note, I mean, negotiating those things, I really like to stress that, because when physicians normally call me up and they're like, what can a union do? Can they, I guess you can negotiate more money and maybe not fire me, which is definitely true and definitely important. But like, when you start talking about ratios, you start talking about compensation models. Those Mercy Unity doctors, it was 2 hospitals that unionized. They reached out to us because the employer had told them they were going to change them from RVU-based production to salary. And it turns out, for all the crap they have to put up with on a day-to-day basis, they want to get paid for it, so like that was an important thing. But then they start diving into it and they start realizing all the other things that are wrong, all the other things that are broken, the things that make that moral injury go through the roof, that make burnout being, that's a separate conversation, but make those things happen. Like, just in the time that I've been talking with doctors out in Minnesota, there have been 3 physician suicides that I'm aware of. So when you're talking about things like unionizing, don't just look at it as more money. Look at it like, what would it mean if you had safe patient ratios, if you had safe staffing numbers, if you had safe policies? I know there's a lot of ED docs in here, Mitch's, circles a lot of ED people, but like, I have clinic docs that I'm working with who are getting assaulted. I mean, within that Alina healthcare system that just came out with that article, and they paused it, they would fire someone for getting late on their payments. There was literally a blind mother with a baby, and the mother had a broken leg. She couldn't afford her $4,500 bill, so they fired her. There have been patients that have sexually assaulted, physically assaulted physicians, and the organization will not fire them. So, I mean, like, you really need to put things in perspective. Like, learn to complain a little bit. Learn to say that this isn't right, that this isn't fair, that you have a voice that matters. And remember that this oath that holds you so dearly, start fighting for it. Start fighting for the ability to maintain your standards that you think are appropriate and the professional judgment that you think matters. Just really quick, CMGs, if they set us up as 1099s, is unionization not possible? As to Michelle's answer of it depends, is the answer to every single question. How your company set you up, if it's legally and true and accurate setup of a 1099, I wouldn't be able to help you all. But the vast majority of 1099s are misclassified, and they're actually W-2s, and you're being denied multiple benefits of the law, not unionization only being one of those.
Great. And so I'm just going to jump in with the 1099 thing. Is that a whole big barrier to, proclaim that you're not, that you're misclassified, or should you just pretty much be like, we're treated as employees? Let me talk to Joe Crane and let's unionize. And that's just going to be a little small bump along the road, because we're going to be able to just show the courts that we're really treated as employees.
Yeah, no, there's multiple avenues of everything here. I mean, I'll pick on an example of these non-competes, and you can apply it to the 1099s. Once you're organized, and I don't mean just like, you've officially become a union and you've won an election. Once you are organized as a group, instead of 600 individuals, you have 600 people. Let's be honest, 500 people who, there's always people who don't want to play along, but that are helping out and supported. Your power is immense. So if you want to get rid of 1099s, you're now a lobbying group. You now represent millions of patients. And you can utilize that power to go into it and go as a lobbying group and get into the politicians, utilize the connections that people like myself have, and go in there and get rid of it that way. Or you just unionize and they say you can't unionize. And you say, oh yeah, we just did. And then they say, well, you're not. And then you say, well, we're not going to work. And then they're like, oh crap, maybe you are unionized. You need to realize the power you have collectively once you are organized is nothing comparable to what you have on an individual basis. So, and I see a lot of things in these chats, and I'm not trying to ignore questions or anything, but like, can we do this? How can we do this? None of those really matter until you get organized. And then the can is you can, and the how depends. But this country has been shaped, and not just by union organizing, by people getting organized and pushing for what they need to see changed. And you have more power than any other group in this country. Flex your muscle and save healthcare before, I don't know, not like how that one ends out. So, and on the 1099s, Stacy, the options that call me first, and then I can give you a better idea of whether or not you're an actual 1099. But unless you get to pick your schedule whenever you show up to work, however you show up, you can leave in the middle of a shift. You're not a 1099. You're a W-2 that's not getting all the benefits. They classify them at you because individually, you all think you have no rights. Welcome to the working class.
Thanks. And I think that is the key issue, is doctors don't want to admit to themselves that we're the working class, and 75% of us absolutely are. And once we're there, acceptance is that first component, and either you got to take it back or you got to realize where you are. And I think that is the most important part here, is understanding why we're doing it. Maybe it's for a $5 raise and some, very legitimate to have some leave, family medical leave, or, for paternity and maternity leave, but we're doing it for the working conditions that benefit our patients. And I think that's the biggest part. I see
work is noble. Doctors are among the noblest of workers. The problem is doctors no longer have the autonomy, the clout, the force they had in directing patient care and their own well-being and future. And that's the realization that's going to have to be dealt with, because that's what makes this conversation necessary.
Thank you. I see Dr. Gupta with his hand up.
I think it's a great conference. I joined late, but you're right. I think one of the things which I noticed being in the same hospital with Trinity, we complain too much, but we don't join the membership, Michigan State Medical Society membership. What I'm saying, people don't realize AMA membership. I mean, they're doing so much work, but a lot of our doctors they complain about, but they don't get organized. Even the Michigan State Medical Society, Oakland County Medical Society, I'm on the board member, and people just don't belong to the organized medicine in the first place. And once you are there, we always do look at this conference. I mean, this is a great conference. I have a son who's an ER physician in Indiana. I always hear from ER physician was a top specialty 5-7 years back. Now, TeamHealth, I'm sure you must have heard about TeamHealth happening in Indiana and Illinois. It's a powerful motivation conference. Really, thanks for arranging this. Really appreciate it.
No, like I started with this conference last year and now a year later we're unionized. So it was a good source of information to kind of like break some of the myths up. And then like once you start investigating and talking to people and talking to lawyers and realizing what's actually possible versus what they're telling you, it's like, and you just have to be kind of prepared for a fight. Like you said, like we're trying to vote, but that doesn't mean that even if we vote it through, that they're going to allow it to go through without a challenge. You know, like it's you just have to fight them every step of the way and be prepared.
I'm quite balanced. I have two boys who are lawyers. One boy married a doctor. I have a son his wife is a doctor. So I have all 5 different people, and I see this all the time. This is a great conference. I think we should keep this channel open and keep communication regularly.
No, for sure.
Thank you. Thanks so much. And to your point about meeting our specialty size and organized medicine, we're going to be broaching that heavily tomorrow. I think, as David Feinwachs says, the AMA at this point is kind of a publishing house, and I don't say financially conflicted, but financially stable without necessarily the membership. And we're going to be talking to the AMA tomorrow with a representative from there about the corporate practice of medicine. So we do need to bring in all of those groups, but we're really, really fractured as far as organized medicine goes, with a lot of conflicts of interest. So I'd like to see us organize, and that's what these conversations are about.